So today we're just going to basically go over the COVID-19 paperwork, the new coronavirus addendum that CAR has put out. And we'll go over some pieces, the important pieces of that addendum, because we've seen a few coronavirus addenda being floated around. Some are being done by CAR and some by attorneys of real estate brokers around the country. So I just want you guys to be careful, especially if we're not using a CAR contract or you're a listing agent, you're receiving an offer with a different coronavirus addendum. Just some things to look for in that addendum to make sure those things are in place, so that you'll have a hassle-free, trouble-free transaction and less problems down the road. Along with the coronavirus addendum, there's another form that needs to accompany that in the event something does happen, and that's the NUCC, the Notice of Unforeseen Coronavirus Circumstance. We'll go over that. In the event that one of the buyers or a seller does fall victim to a circumstance, you need to submit this form in order to address any of the issues in the coronavirus addendum to have those protections of the buyer's deposit. And then we'll also talk about the residential purchase agreement. Now, we're not going to go line by line through the residential purchase agreement today. We don't have that kind of time. But what we will do is go through the purchase agreement with regards to this specific addendum, where you should mention it in the purchase agreement and where other protections for you and your clients reside in the residential purchase agreement. So we'll go through a couple of very specific portions of that. And that should do it for today. So without any further ado, let's see how I can get the slides going. Let's talk about this coronavirus addendum. Okay, it's called Form CVA. If you want to fast track it in your CAR forms, it is in the CAR forms now. It provides escrow instructions in the event the transaction is canceled or delayed due to the coronavirus addendum. And it really favors the buyer. So let me pop it in here so we can see what the form is. Hopefully this works. There we go, the coronavirus addendum. Now here we're purchasing a property at 2520 Mission College Boulevard. You guys should all be familiar with this one. Anyway, I needed to put something in just to get this screen to print. But this is the coronavirus addendum. And basically what we're doing here is you want to fill this out as completely as possible. Make sure that you're referencing the purchase agreement, used to make the contract and the date, describing the property and the buyers and sellers. Now, this addendum can be used for new transactions that we're starting now. It can also be used in transactions that you're currently in. So if you wanted to add this addendum to a transaction you're currently working with, you want to make sure you hit that box right here that says this amendment is already this is an amendment to an already accepted agreement. Very difficult in general to amend mutually accepted agreements, but with I guess the unforeseen scope of this pandemic, it's a very good reason to be able to go ahead and do that. Now, as we go through this here, it just kind of defines what the epidemic is. The current worldwide coronavirus pandemic has an unprecedented impact on real estate transactions, including but not limited to travel restrictions, self-imposed and governmentally required isolations, the closure of both government and private offices, and businesses providing integral functions to the closing of a real estate transaction, such as inspecting, repairing, packing and moving, funding, recording, and declarations of states of emergency and so-called shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders, among others, unforeseen coronavirus circumstances. Now, we right now are in shelter-in-place, so this is definitely very applicable to the situation that we're in right now in Santa Clara County. Now, luckily, we have been deemed as an essential business. So starting this week, and we'll come out with new rules and regulations to standards of practice, but we are now considered an essential business in California. So we are going to start seeing more activity. Surprisingly enough, over the past few weeks, even though we have been in a shelter in place, our real estate market has actually still been kind of moving. I was surprised to see the amount of transactions that we've had in just the past couple of weeks, and it's been pretty significant. Last week, I was kind of tracking the inventory, and we went from about a little over 1,000 units. By the end of the week, we're almost down to 700 units in the county, which tells me that our real estate market isn't really slowing down because of this pandemic. It's slowed down, but it's not slowing. It's not going to stop. We have a lot of motivated people working really hard in the valley. So The form is intended to contractually address unforeseen the circumstance. So in the event that somebody does contract the virus or someone's in a position where they can't execute their contract, then this form will take over and provide an automatic extension of time so that the affected party doesn't have to worry about losing their real estate contract. They automatically get a 30-day extension. Now, this is very good for a buyer, right? The buyer's in contract. For some reason, they can't be on their control. They can't close, but they still get to delay the escrow up to 30, maybe 60 days without the seller having a say. So this is very important for your sellers to understand. In the event if this addendum is in place and a buyer does have a need, they can extend the escrow up to 30, maybe 60 days automatically. So you don't have a choice. Now, being good people in general, good-natured people, I think most folks are. People do seem to come to an agreement with these types of things, mutually, and you still can, of course. But in this case, because of the uncertainty, it's good to have that secured for your buyer to know that they can get an additional 30 days. Because the seller, in our market's hot. The seller may have accepted an offer that they're no longer happy with 2 or 3 weeks later. And they may not be very amicable about extending a contract when they know that, hey, if this guy leaves, I'm going to get an extra 1%, 2%, 3% from the next buyer. So from the seller's perspective, it's very important you understand that. And when you're counseling your sellers, you let them know that, hey, if we do work with this addendum, that things can get extended an extra 30 to 60 days. So if either buyer or seller is affected by the unforeseen coronavirus circumstances, the party shall deliver to the other a notice of unforeseen coronavirus circumstance, which both identifies and provides verification of the unforeseen coronavirus circumstance. So this is kind of really important because some of the other forms and other addendums that I have seen circulating out there, they don't have a secondary form called the NUCC. What this does is it basically validates that the party has an issue related to coronavirus. It's specific to this. It's not for any reason the buyer can now decide, hey, I now have extra contingencies. I can now haphazardly cancel this contract whether I want to or not. That's not the case. You still need to get in with this form in play. The buyer would still, or whoever affected party would still need to prove that they are in fact dealing with a delay due to the coronavirus. It can't be for some secondary arbitrary reason. Okay. The third thing about this, extension of mutual time or cancellation. By default, it gives us the following contingencies shall be extended for 30 days. The buyer has the option to extend that or increase that or lower that. Keep in mind, guys, that even though these deadlines may come to an end, you can still negotiate with the seller and create an extension. It is very important that we do that and have that extension in writing, because if we do not, what happens is time is of the essence starts to get thrown out of the contract. In the real estate purchase agreement, there is a term called time is of the essence, which basically adheres the timelines to the contract to being important. If time is of the essence is ignored throughout the contract, then at the end of the contract, when it's exponentially more important, like we're supposed to close and collect millions of dollars and they're not closing, your protections against time is of the essence also go away. So be very careful in your contracts to make sure that you're staying within the timelines afforded in those contracts. And if you need more time, make sure you get those extensions in writing. So just because you have this here doesn't mean you can't extend it. It can be extended if you need more time and the seller is agreeable to that. But also keep in mind the seller doesn't have to, right? After the extra 30 days or whatever time specified in 4A expires, the seller may choose to cancel the agreement and move on to a different buyer. There's nothing you can do about that. The deposit always goes back to the buyer in this case. So you can extend the time and or after the time expires, if both parties or one of the parties decides they no longer want to continue with the contract, they click the mutual cancellation. This form, if this is the form being used and the reason for canceling the contract, this is the only form that you need to cancel the escrow and return the deposit back to the buyer. It specifically states that in section 4B. No demand to close escrow is otherwise applicable shall be required. Buyer's deposit shall be returned to buyer minus fees and costs incurred by buyer, or the buyer's deposit shall be released to seller. That's something you have to check in the event that's the situation. But by default, it goes back to the buyer. And if the parties do decide to cancel the contract, they should have the NUCC form also filled out and attached. And here it is, the notice of unforeseen coronavirus circumstance. Right. So let's go through this one real quick. Any questions, by the way, on the coronavirus addendum? Anyone anywhere? Is pretty clear. Basically, just in review, it provides escrow instructions in the event the transaction is canceled or delayed, and it does favor the buyer, because if the buyer can't perform, they can't extend the contract without needing extra permission from the seller.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah. Alan.
Hey, yeah, it's Alan. I'm in a interesting situation because I have we had put in we got in the contract before this mess, before shelter in place. The buyer's agent, of course, wants us to sign this, but from a seller perspective, because we know it's skewed towards the buyer, we don't want to sign this document. I mean, I think we're okay with extending escrow if needed and being understanding, but we don't want to give them this out. You know what I mean? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. If you admit this addendum and you're on the listing side and you don't work with this addendum at all, then you have the control. You have the negotiating leverage. If the buyer does unfortunately fall victim to one of these conditions, or they get sick or something happens, and the buyer does not have this addendum in place, it's the seller's mercy. So if you're the seller, it's good to have that control. If you don't mind giving it up a little bit, this will go ways to kind of ease the buyer's mind that, hey, in the event that something does happen to me or inspectors or something, I can get a little extra time. Now, this is kind of where it's important that the CAR form is used, necessarily outside of some of the other forms that are floating around there, because the CAR form specifically addresses the delay for coronavirus-related issues. I've seen some of the other forms out there. You got to read them, because these guys are slick. They'll sneak stuff in, and if you don't read it, it's there. You're subject to it. So the forms that I've seen come out have had very, very liberal terms for the buyer's reasons for cancellation. Basically, I've seen some that say, hey, for any reason, the buyer can cancel. And it's on a coronavirus addendum, but it's at any reason. So as a listing agent, you want to make sure that you're aware of what types of things the buyers might be slipping in. Because if they give you a non-contingent offer, then slip in a third-party coronavirus addendum that says the buyer can cancel for any reason, well, you don't have a non-contingent offer anymore, do you? You have an offer with a lot of contingencies. So just be understanding that the situation that you're in, because if the buyer cancels and the seller's sitting there waiting to collect his deposit, but it's not happening because he has this addendum, he might be upset with you. So make sure that the sellers understand what they're getting into when they agree to these things. And with the CAR form, it does have some very specific terms that the affected party has to comply to in order for this to be valid. So on this form here, the notice of unforeseen coronavirus circumstances, the unforeseen coronavirus circumstance that is applicable to the affected party and is the reason for the extension of time or mutual cancellation is specified. So they have to specify why it's not working out for them. So maybe it's loan related, loss of income due to unforeseen coronavirus circumstance. That's a valid reason. Maybe a notary can't do their job on a specific day, or we can't get a notary that wants to meet with someone on a specific day. That's a legitimate reason. Lender delay due to the unforeseen coronavirus circumstance, that could definitely happen. The shelter in place or stay at home or other government order presenting difficulties in scheduling inspections. And right now, I believe that the inspectors are out there doing their bit. It's recommended that we allow the parties in the transaction to go ahead and order those inspections for technical purposes. We don't want to be violating any shelter in place, so we don't want to ask the inspectors to go out and make the inspection. But if a seller or buyer calls, it's on them. Okay. And then personal impact. Affected party has a confirmed diagnosis or a hospitalization or is quarantined. they can check the box and get a doctor's note, or present their reasons as stated below. And by signing below, the affected party acknowledge they have read, understand, and received a copy of this agreement. So with this one in place, it kind of validates why a party is not performing, and is very specific. So that way, Alan, situations arise from the buyer side. Loss of job, I think, is one that's going to be a pretty big player in some cases. But a lot of our people in our areas, the tech workers, they're still working, in my understanding, even though they're working from home. So that I don't think is going to be a very valid one. But in the event people at your title company get sick, I can see them closing offices and causing delays. So just some things to really keep in mind as you proceed forward in your real estate transactions over the next, I think, 60 to 90 days at least. This is going to be something that we're going to see. Hopefully end of summer, this will all be over with. So we're going to be doing business over the next few months, and I'm sure most of us are. We're going to want to incorporate this as for buyers, incorporate this addendum into your purchase agreement. As we've already established, it's not necessarily seller friendly. Maybe getting it signed after the fact may be a challenge, but as you're presenting your offer with your offer, it's a good idea to maybe have this in place. Now, as far as regards with multiple offers and being competitive, these are things that you guys are going to have to talk about with your buyers to see how much risk they want to take on for their transactions. But if we are going to make this a part of the transaction, just be sure in the residential purchase agreement that we reference this addendum to make it a part of the contract. If we don't reference this addendum and make it a part of the contract, it's just as if it's being added later. And if it's being added later, it may not protect you like you hoped it would. Okay. The section in the purchase agreement is section 5 under addenda and advisories. And right now, I mean, it's a relatively new. CAR just added the COVID addendums to the WIN forms. So you're going to have to write into the other remarks on section 5 under addenda and advisories, the COVID, the CVA advisory, to make it a part of the contract. That way, it'll be part of the deal and it'll protect your buyers as it should. The other things that protect your buyers, obviously the biggest thing that protects our buyers in contracts is contingencies. So, and that's the first thing to go out the door in our competitive market when we're competing with multiple offers. But just some things to keep in mind, guys, when we're putting these things together with regards to contingencies and having protections in place. I like to have at least a day on the contracts for contingencies for clarification purposes, because some of these addendums that come in after the fact, they're adding days to contingencies. And if you have 0, it may not work. Or if you have 1, it will, or it could work down the road to extend those contingencies by specific periods of days. And contingencies are obviously our loan contingencies. Right now, with regards to lenders being a little fishy with non-government backed loans, we want to make sure that if you do have loan contingencies in place, that you also specify here the terms of the loan contingencies in D1 and D2. In the event that things change and interest rates rise, your clients will be protected under those contingencies, even though they may still qualify for the loans. So just make sure that we do have this sections filled out if we do have financing and appraisal contingencies in place. The financing contingencies are broken down between loans and appraisals. Typically, I like to put even if we're going with no contingencies on the loans, you click the no loan contingency box here. That means you're very confident that your client will be able to get their loan. Hopefully they have either a government-backed loan or they're so qualified that credit score is over 740 and plenty of cash on hand before going with a no loan contingency, especially today. Make sure that you guys are ultra qualified before that happens. See, we have the section 5 covered, and then The other part is with regard to our other contingencies for disclosures and inspections, and there's section 14. This is the section where I like to have at least one day for review. And then if you're going to go ahead and make that strong offer without contingencies, send that removal of contingencies with offer. And you could do that even if you have that day. I know a lot of agents are asking for 24 hours to get that deposit in there. It all kind of comes together as one nice, small, happy package. 24 hours for the deposit, 1 day for contingencies that comes with the removal. So it's just for paperwork purposes down the road. Like, for example, if you had to introduce a CVA into the agreement, or something did happen where you had to make some type of extension to the contract, that you have some kind of protection there. Notice or buyer and seller to perform. That's another one topic I'd like to cover with specific regards to this situation. In the event that the people are not, or they're dragging their feet, they're not performing to the contract, we want to make sure that your sellers stay in control, and you want to send your notices to perform as soon as you possibly can. Now, one thing that I like to do, especially when working with buyer's agents on the other side that are known to delay, or when a situation, or just where the contract presents itself for delays, I like to send those notices to perform early, because that gives your seller the control. Just because it's a notice to perform for a specific day doesn't mean you can't send that notice a day or 2 days before that timeline expires. So if you do send that notice to perform a day or two before, that makes that deadline a real deadline. It gives the seller the opportunity to cancel or change the terms, or be in control of the negotiation. I think with regards to the contract, that's pretty much it. Liquidated damages is something that's very important in the event that things do fall apart. It does limit the seller's recourse to only 3% or whatever the deposit is placed in escrow. So make sure that's initialed, especially with all the complications with the CVAs that are coming down. And just as everything, arbitration of disputes, that will also go a long way in the event that we do have some kind of disagreement with our other party. Make sure that the arbitration agreements are initial. That'll save a lot of money in court costs. And I think that's pretty much it with regards to the purchase agreement and how it relates to the COVID.